All right, so today we're doing a deep dive into something pretty fascinating. 10 Buddhist principles that supposedly can lead to unshakable inner peace. You share this really thought-provoking article, and I gotta say, some of these principles really jumped out at me. Especially curious to see how they apply in our, crazy modern world.
Yeah, it's definitely a rich area to explore, for sure. These principles offer some really timeless wisdom that can be incredibly relevant, even amidst all the chaos of modern life.
Totally. And what I loved about this article is how it, lays out these principles with such vivid examples. Makes them really accessible. I think by the end of this deep dive, you'll walk away with some, pretty tangible takeaways for cultivating more peace in your own life, no matter what's going on around you.
Totally agree. Practicality is key. It's one thing to grasp these concepts intellectually, but the true magic really happens when we can actually embody them, in our daily experience.
For sure. Okay, so let's dive right in. The first principle that really resonated with me, and I'm curious to hear your take on this, is the principle about handling insults and criticism. The article uses this really powerful analogy of words as arrows.
Oh, yeah, the untouchable mountain analogy. Yeah, it's such a vivid way of understanding how we can choose not to be wounded by negativity. The idea is that words only have the power to harm us if we choose to stand in their path. Let them pierce our armor, so to speak.
It reminds me of that saying, you can't stop the birds from flying overhead, but you can prevent them from building a nest in your hair.
Right. But it's not just about ignoring negativity, is it? It's about choosing how we respond, how we process those arrows that come our way.
Exactly, yeah. And this goes beyond simply brushing off negativity. It encourages a deeper awareness of our own reactions, right? The Buddha himself highlighted this, comparing holding on to anger to drinking poison and expecting the other person to die. It's such a potent image. It really underscores the futility of letting anger control us. You ever notice how sometimes, even years later, like a harsh comment can still sting? It's wild how those words can have such a lasting impact. So how can we cultivate that untouchable mountain resilience? Like in the heat of the moment, those arrows feel like they're coming at us from all directions.
It's definitely a practice. It takes time to develop that level of, awareness and resilience. But one thing that I think can be helpful is to remember that the person, launching those arrows is often acting from their own pain or insecurity. Their words are more a reflection of their inner state than a true reflection of our worth.
That's a helpful perspective shift. Instead of taking things so personally, we can see that negativity as like a symptom of something deeper going on within that person. It kind of reminds me of the next principle, which is all about seeing everyone as a teacher. It's such a radical concept, isn't it? To think that even the people who frustrate us the most could actually be offering us like really valuable lessons.
It is a radical idea, and it can be really challenging to embrace, especially when we're dealing with those difficult people. But if we can shift our perspective from judgment to curiosity, we open ourselves up to a whole new level of understanding, maybe even compassion.
So how has your own perspective on challenging people evolved, over time? Have you found yourself seeing those challenging interactions as opportunities for growth?
Yeah.
Even if those lessons are hard-won?
Definitely. It's an ongoing process, but I think the more I've explored Buddhist philosophy, the more I've come to appreciate the wisdom in this principle. Instead of, labeling people as good or bad, I found it's more helpful to focus on the lessons they might be presenting, even if those lessons are disguised as conflict or frustration.
It's like we're constantly being presented with opportunities to practice patience, understanding, and maybe even forgiveness in like the most unexpected places.
Yeah, and this idea of seeing everyone as a teacher, it connects so beautifully with that Buddhist concept of interconnectedness, right?
Yeah.
The idea that we're all kind of interwoven into this tapestry of life, our actions, our reactions, it all has ripple effects. So by approaching even those difficult people with a sense of openness and curiosity, we're not only learning from them, but also contributing to, a more harmonious environment for everyone involved.
Yeah, that interconnectedness, it really amplifies the impact of our choices, doesn't it?
Yeah.
And speaking of impactful choices, the next principle dives into an emotion that can be like so potent, so potentially destructive: envy. And I got to admit, this is one I struggle with, especially in today's social media driven world. Like it seems like everyone is showcasing their highlight reel,
Yeah.
The article suggests that instead of letting that envy fester, we can transmute it into inspiration.
Yeah, that's the heart of it. Envy can be a powerful emotion, but instead of letting it consume us, we can choose to reframe it. It's about recognizing that another person's success doesn't diminish our own potential. In fact, it can serve as a roadmap, highlighting possibilities we might not have even considered before.
Instead of asking why them, we can ask, what can I learn from them?
Exactly. Yeah, that Buddhist concept of mudita, or sympathetic joy, reminds us that celebrating another's success actually expands our own capacity for happiness, not diminishes it. And it challenges us to, explore what truly brings us joy and fulfillment.
So it's not about suppressing those feelings of envy, but rather about recognizing them and then consciously choosing to shift our perspective, to see those achievements as a source of inspiration instead of resentment.
And it ties back to, that abundance mindset we were discussing earlier. When we believe there's enough success, enough happiness to go around for everyone, we can genuinely celebrate other people's achievements without feeling threatened or diminished.
So, what's one thing you've admired in someone else's life recently? Something that, sparked that initial pang of envy, but then you consciously chose to reframe it as inspiration. I'm always curious about how people put these principles into action in their own lives.
Oh, that's a great question. Recently, a colleague of mine achieved a professional milestone that, I've been working towards for a while. Initially, I felt that familiar twinge of envy, but then I consciously shifted my focus to what I admired about her journey. I realized her success was a result of her dedication and her willingness to take risks and her commitment to her craft. And instead of letting envy hold me back, I used it as fuel to, refine my own approach and set new goals.
That's a fantastic example of how we can really turn envy into a catalyst for growth. And it leads perfectly into the next principle, which is about finding that delicate balance between having high standards for ourselves and tolerance for others. And this one really resonates with me because I think it's something a lot of us grapple with, especially in today's high-achieving culture.
Definitely a dance, a continual process of finding that equilibrium. On the one hand, having high standards for ourselves can be incredibly motivating, propels us towards growth and excellence. But on the other hand, holding others to those same rigid standards can lead to, frustration, disappointment, and strained relationships.
It's almost like we're setting ourselves and everyone around us up for failure because, let's face it, none of us are perfect. The article sums it up so perfectly. Be the best you can be, but don't expect everyone else to be on the same level. It's about embracing that, individuality, that uniqueness in ourselves and others, while still striving for personal growth.
It reminds me of the Buddhist teaching about self-compassion. He emphasized that we, as much as anybody in the entire universe, deserve our own love and affection. And when we can extend that same kindness and understanding to ourselves, it becomes easier to be more tolerant and forgiving of others, recognizing that we're all on our own unique journeys.
It's like we're all climbing different mountains.
Right.
And the view from the top might look different for each of us, but the journey itself is just as valid and worthy of respect.
That's a beautiful analogy. It reminds us that comparison truly is the thief of joy. When we're constantly comparing ourselves to others, we lose sight of our own unique strengths and gifts, and we miss out on the opportunity to appreciate the diversity and richness of human experience.
That's so true. And speaking of embracing the richness of human experience, the next principle delves into a concept that can be both challenging and incredibly empowering, the idea that emotional suffering is often a choice. Now, before we dive into that, I just want to acknowledge that this is a complex topic. So we're not suggesting that anyone is intentionally choosing to suffer, but the article points to the idea that while painful experiences are, inevitable, the degree to which we suffer as a result of those experiences is often influenced by our own minds.
That's a key distinction. Life, inevitably throws us curveballs, heartbreak, loss, disappointment. But it's how we respond to those curveballs that determines the depth and duration of our suffering.
The article uses the example of betrayal, right? Suggesting that if someone betrays us, we can choose to, wallow in that pain, to let it define us. Or we can choose to accept what happened, learn from it, and allow ourselves to move forward. But how do we actually make that choice when the pain feels so raw and overwhelming?
That's where the Buddhist principle of non-attachment comes in. Now, it's important to clarify that non-attachment doesn't mean suppressing our emotions or pretending that those difficult experiences don't hurt. It's more about recognizing that we have a choice in how we relate to those experiences, We can choose to cling to the pain, replaying the events over and over in our minds, or we can choose to acknowledge the pain, allow ourselves to feel it fully, and then gradually release our grip on it.
So it's not about denying or suppressing those emotions, but rather about observing them with a sense of detachment, recognizing that they are temporary states, like waves passing through the ocean of our being.
Exactly. And that's a practice, a skill that takes time and effort to cultivate, right?
Hmm.
But the more we can develop this ability to observe our emotions without judgment or attachment, the more freedom and ease we experience in navigating, life's inevitable challenges.
I love how the article quotes the Buddha on this. It says, "No one saves us but ourselves. No one can and no one may. We ourselves must walk the path."
Such a powerful reminder that we are ultimately responsible for our own well-being, our own liberation from suffering. And it's an invitation to, cultivate those inner resources we need to navigate life's ups and downs with greater grace and resilience.
It's like we're being called to step into our own power, to become the heroes of our own journeys, even when those journeys take us through some pretty dark and challenging terrain.
Exactly. And that brings us to another principle that can be incredibly liberating: acceptance.
This is where the article uses that powerful image of the river, right? It suggests that fighting against the current only exhausts us, but surrendering to the flow, that allows us to move forward effortlessly. I love that analogy because it highlights the futility of, resisting what is.
It's such a brilliant metaphor, and it applies so beautifully to life's challenges,
Hmm.
When we resist what is, we create so much internal struggle and suffering. But when we can accept reality as it is, not how we wish it to be, we open ourselves up to a more peaceful and easeful experience.
And it's not about being passive or giving up,
Yeah.
right? It's about recognizing what we can control and what we can't.
Yeah.
We can't control the weather, traffic, or, other people's behavior,
Yeah.
but we can control our own responses to those situations.
Exactly. Acceptance is about wisdom. It's about seeing things clearly without judgment or resistance. And when we can do that, we free up so much energy that we can then direct towards creating positive change in our lives.
It's like choosing to, go with the flow of the river instead of constantly trying to swim upstream. And sometimes surrendering to that flow can actually lead us to, unexpected and beautiful destinations.
I love that perspective. It reminds us that even when things aren't going according to our plan, there's often, a greater wisdom at play, guiding us towards what's truly meant for us.
So, what's one area of your life where you found it challenging to practice acceptance? What helped you to shift your perspective and, surrender to the flow of things?
That's a great question. And I'll admit, acceptance is a practice I'm still working on, One area where I found it particularly challenging is in letting go of expectations in relationships. I have a tendency to build up these idealized images of how things should be. And when reality doesn't match those expectations, I can get caught in a cycle of disappointment and frustration.
I think we've all been there. It's so easy to get attached to those idealized images, especially in relationships.
It is, yeah. And what's helped me to shift my perspective is recognizing that those expectations are often based on, my own projections, my own desires, rather than the reality of the other person.
So it's about letting go of that need to control or change the other person,
Mhm.
and instead focusing on understanding and accepting them as they are.
Exactly. And that doesn't mean compromising our own values or boundaries. It's about approaching the relationship with a sense of openness and curiosity, allowing it to unfold organically rather than trying to force it into some, preconceived mold.
And that can be so freeing, can't it? It takes the pressure off, allowing the relationship to breathe and evolve naturally.
It does. And it allows for, more genuine connection and intimacy because we're relating to the other person from a place of authenticity rather than from a place of projection or expectation.
Beautifully said. And this idea of acceptance actually connects beautifully with the next principle, which is about finding harmony with nature. The article suggests that spending time in nature, observing its, effortless wisdom and integrating it into our lives can be a powerful source of peace.
Oh, this is one of my favorite principles because it speaks to, that profound connection between our inner world and the natural world. The natural world is constantly teaching us about, cycles of growth and decay and renewal. When we reconnect with nature, we tap into this deeper rhythm that can help us to feel more grounded and at peace amidst, all the chaos of modern life.
The article even quotes the Buddha on this, saying, "Just as a candle cannot burn without fire, men cannot live without a spiritual life."
Such a poignant quote. And it speaks to the importance of nourishing our souls, connecting with something greater than ourselves. And nature provides such a beautiful and accessible pathway to that connection.
Absolutely. So how can we bring, more nature into our daily routines? Even small things like taking a walk in the park or paying attention to the sunrise can make a difference, right?
Absolutely. Even just a few minutes of mindful connection with nature can have a profound impact on our well-being. It can help to, reduce stress, improve our mood, and even boost our creativity.
Sometimes, just stepping outside and taking a few deep breaths of fresh air can completely shift my perspective and bring this sense of calm. It's like hitting the reset button on my nervous system.
I totally agree. And I think it's also about cultivating a sense of awe and wonder for, the natural world. When we can appreciate the beauty of a flower, the majesty of a mountain, or the intricate patterns of a seashell, it opens up this sense of wonder and gratitude that can, transform our whole outlook on life.
I love that. And I think this principle ties back to those earlier ones about acceptance and letting go, right? When we observe the natural world, we see that everything is in constant flux. There's a time for growth, a time for dormancy, a time for expansion, and a time for contraction.
Exactly. And by aligning ourselves with those natural rhythms, we can find more ease and flow in our own lives.
And that brings us to another principle that I think is really foundational for, inner peace, ethical living. The article emphasizes the connection between acting with integrity and experiencing a calm mind.
This is where that Buddhist concept of, right action comes into play. It's about aligning our actions with our values and striving to live in a way that benefits both ourselves and others.
Yeah, the article paraphrases this principle beautifully. It says, when your actions are in line with your values, you naturally feel more at peace.
It's so true. When we live with integrity, we don't have to worry about hiding our actions or feeling guilty about our choices. There's a sense of inner alignment that brings, a deep sense of peace.
And the article connects this principle back to some, core Buddhist teachings. Right speech, right livelihood, right action. These are all interconnected aspects of ethical living, aren't they?
Absolutely. Right speech encourages us to speak truthfully and kindly, avoiding gossip and harsh words and, divisive language. Right livelihood calls us to engage in work that's aligned with our values and doesn't harm others. And right action reminds us to act with compassion, generosity, and mindfulness in, all areas of our lives.
It's about living a life that feels, authentic and true to ourselves, a life that reflects our deepest values and aspirations. So let me ask you this. Are there any areas of your life where you've consciously made choices to align your actions with your values, even if those choices were, difficult or inconvenient?
I'm always inspired by people who walk their talk, who live their values in a tangible way. That's such a great question, and I appreciate you asking. I think for me, one of the most significant areas has been in my career. A few years ago, I was working in a job that, while it was financially rewarding, wasn't aligned with my core values. I felt this growing sense of dissonance between, who I was at work and who I was outside of work.
That's there was a misalignment between your inner compass and the direction your career was heading.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And it was causing me a lot of internal conflict and stress. So I made this really difficult decision to leave that job and pursue work that was, more aligned with my values, even though it meant taking a financial risk and stepping outside my comfort zone.
Wow, that's such a courageous choice. And I imagine it wasn't easy, but it sounds like it was ultimately a deeply fulfilling decision.
It was. It wasn't always easy, but I've never regretted that decision. And what I've learned is that when we live in alignment with our values, we naturally attract opportunities and relationships that support our, growth and well-being.
It's like we're sending out a signal to the universe, attracting what resonates with our truest selves. And it creates this ripple effect, inspiring others to do the same.
Oh, I love that perspective. And it reminds me of the next principle, which is about the transformative power of gratitude. The article emphasizes the importance of shifting our focus from what we lack to what we have, training our minds to appreciate the abundance that already exists in our lives.
Gratitude is such a powerful antidote to negativity and dissatisfaction. When we can cultivate a grateful heart, we start to see the world through such a different lens. We notice the simple joys, appreciate the kindness of others, and find beauty in those everyday moments that we might otherwise, take for granted.
It's like we're switching from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset, recognizing the richness that already surrounds us, even in the midst of challenges.
The article even suggests, keeping a gratitude journal, writing down things we're grateful for each day to really cultivate that awareness. Have you ever tried that practice? I'm always curious to hear about people's personal experiences with these principles.
I have. And it's been a game changer for sure. I used to really struggle with negativity and, a tendency to focus on what was lacking in my life. But when I started consistently practicing gratitude, I noticed this like profound shift in my overall well-being. It's like those small moments of appreciation started to like outweigh the negative thoughts, creating a more positive and, optimistic
It's
outlook.
almost like we're retraining our brains to focus
Yes.
on the good, to see the glass as half full instead of half empty, right?
Yeah.
And that shift in perspective can have such a ripple effect on our emotions, our relationships, even our, physical health.
It's amazing, isn't it? The power of our minds to shape our reality. And speaking of shaping our reality, the final principle in this article is about letting go, a concept that's central to Buddhist philosophy, but that can be so challenging to, put into practice.
Yeah, this is where we really get to the heart of Buddhist philosophy, right? The Buddha taught that attachment is the root of suffering. When we cling to things, people, or outcomes, we create a lot of unnecessary pain for ourselves. And letting go, it doesn't mean giving up, right? It's more about releasing our grip on something that is no longer serving us.
Exactly. It's not about passivity or resignation. It's about recognizing that there's a natural flow to life and that sometimes the best thing we can do is, surrender to that flow, trusting that things will unfold as they should. We can't control everything, and when we try to, we often create more resistance and suffering.
The article uses a great analogy here, comparing, holding onto sand in your fist versus holding it with an open palm. When we grip tightly, the sand slips away. But when we open our hand, it remains.
Oh, I love that analogy. It so perfectly illustrates the paradox of letting go. When we try to control everything, we actually lose our grip. But when we surrender, we paradoxically gain this sense of, freedom and ease. And it can apply to so many areas of our lives, letting go of past hurts, letting go of expectations, letting go of the need to be right all the time.
So what's one thing you've consciously chosen to let go of recently? I'm always inspired by people's, willingness to share their own experiences with these practices, to show that we're all in this together, navigating these challenges as best we can.
I appreciate you asking. One thing I've been working on letting go of is perfectionism. I have this tendency to set very high standards for myself, and I can get caught in a cycle of self-criticism when things don't go exactly according to plan.
I think that's a common struggle, especially for people who are driven and ambitious. It's like we're constantly striving for that elusive ideal, but the pursuit itself can become a source of stress and anxiety.
It's true. And what's helped me to, let go of that perfectionism is recognizing that it's actually an obstacle to growth and creativity. When we're afraid to make mistakes, we're less likely to take risks, to try new things, to fully express ourselves.
So it's about embracing imperfection as part of the process, allowing ourselves to learn and grow from those mistakes
Yeah.
rather than seeing them as failures.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that, our worthiness isn't dependent on our achievements or our ability to meet some external standard of perfection.
What a powerful reminder. And what's fascinating is how all of these principles that we've discussed, from handling criticism to letting go, they all seem to point back to this core concept of awareness, of cultivating a deeper understanding of our own minds and how they operate.
That's a brilliant observation. And I think that's the essence of, Buddhist philosophy. It's an invitation to cultivate mindful awareness, to observe our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors without judgment, and to use that awareness to make more skillful choices that lead to, greater peace, freedom, and fulfillment.
It's like we're being given this set of tools to navigate the complexities of human experience with more grace and wisdom, tools that can help us to create a more peaceful and joyful reality for ourselves and for, the world around us. And there's so much more to explore here. We've only just scratched the surface of these 10 principles.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this exploration so fascinating. There's always more to discover, more to learn, more to integrate into our lives.
Well, on that note, I think it's time to wrap up part 1 of our deep dive into these 10 powerful Buddhist principles for unshakable peace.
Yeah, it's been a pleasure exploring these ideas with you, and I'm looking forward to diving even deeper in the next part of our conversation.
Me too.
Yeah.
We'll be back soon for part 2, so be sure to tune in to continue our journey towards, greater inner peace.
Welcome back to our deep dive into these 10 Buddhist principles. As we were wrapping up part 1, I was really struck by how much wisdom is packed into these teachings, and I'm excited to continue unpacking them with you. Yeah, it's amazing how these principles, even though they're rooted in ancient philosophy, they feel so relevant to the challenges that we're all facing in our modern lives.
Absolutely. And I think that's what makes this exploration so engaging.
Yeah.
We're not just talking about abstract concepts, like we're talking about practical tools that can really help us navigate our daily lives with more peace and resilience.
Exactly, yeah. It's about bridging that gap between the ancient wisdom and, modern living, finding ways to integrate these teachings into the very fabric of our, experience.
For sure. Okay, so let's dive back into where we left off. We were just discussing that principle of letting go, that idea of releasing our grip on things that no longer serve us. It's such a powerful concept, but it can be so difficult to put into practice, when you're actually trying to do it.
Letting go can be a real challenge, especially in a world that often encourages us to, hold on tightly to everything, our possessions, our relationships, our ideas about how things should be. But the paradox is that the more we try to control, the more we suffer.
It's like that classic image of, trying to hold on to a handful of sand, right? The tighter we squeeze, the more it slips through our fingers.
Right.
But when we open our hand and we loosen our grip, it's able to rest more peacefully.
That's such a perfect analogy. It reminds me of a time when I was going through like a major life transition. I was clinging so desperately to like how I thought things should be, resisting the changes that were happening all around me. It was such a stressful and painful time.
It's interesting how our resistance to change can actually amplify the suffering that we're experiencing, isn't it? It's like we're adding another layer of pain on top of what we're already going through.
Exactly. And what eventually shifted for me was like a realization that I actually had a choice. I could continue to fight against the current, exhausting myself in the process, or I could surrender to the flow of life, trusting that there was a greater wisdom kind of guiding me, even if I couldn't see the path clearly in, that moment.
So it's about recognizing that we're not always in control. And sometimes the most powerful thing we can do is just surrender to what is, right? It's like stepping out of the driver's seat and allowing, a higher power to take the wheel.
Beautifully put. And that surrender, it doesn't mean, giving up or becoming passive. It's about aligning ourselves with a greater force, trusting that we're being guided towards what's ultimately for our highest good, even if the journey takes us through some unexpected, twists and turns.
It requires a lot of faith, doesn't it? Faith in ourselves, faith in the universe, faith that even when things feel really chaotic, there's an underlying order and intelligence that's kind of orchestrating it all.
It does. And that faith is something that we can cultivate, through practices like meditation, mindfulness, and connecting with nature. When we spend time in stillness, when we observe the natural world, we start to tap into that kind of deeper wisdom, that sense of interconnectedness that reminds us that we're not alone.
And speaking of interconnectedness, that brings us back to those 10 principles that we're exploring in this deep dive. It's fascinating how each of these principles seems to weave together, creating a tapestry of wisdom that guides us towards greater peace and fulfillment.
I agree. They're like different facets of the same jewel, each reflecting a unique aspect of, the path to inner peace.
Right. And I think it's important to remember that these principles aren't meant to be followed rigidly or dogmatically. They're more like guideposts, offering us wisdom and insights that we can apply to our lives in a way that feels authentic and meaningful to us.
Exactly. It's about taking what resonates with us and integrating it into our own unique journey, recognizing that the path to, inner peace is not a one-size-fits-all approach.
Right. So let's revisit those principles one by one and see if there are any key takeaways that, we want to emphasize or any new insights that have emerged since our last conversation.
That sounds like a great plan. Where would you like to start?
Well, that first principle about, handling insults and criticism, it continues to resonate with me. That analogy of words as arrows and, choosing not to stand in their path, it's such a powerful reminder that we have a choice in how we respond to negativity.
Yeah, it is. And it's especially relevant in today's world where we're constantly being bombarded with information and opinions, many of which can be quite negative or critical. Social media in particular can feel like a kind of breeding ground for negativity.
It's true. It's so easy to get caught up in that negativity, to allow those arrows to pierce our armor and wound us. But this principle offers a way to navigate all that noise with more grace and resilience, doesn't it?
It does. And it reminds us that other people's words are often a reflection of their own internal state, not a reflection of our worth.
It's like that saying, what other people think of me is none of my business, right?
Exactly. When we can detach from the need for external validation or approval, we become less susceptible to the, slings and arrows of criticism.
And that frees up so much energy to, focus on what truly matters to us. Our values, our passions, our purpose.
Absolutely. And it allows us to show up in the world with more authenticity and confidence because we're no longer defining ourselves based on, other people's opinions.
So moving on to the second principle about seeing everyone as a teacher, I'm curious to kind of explore this idea a bit further. It's such a radical concept, but the more I think about it, the more I see its potential to really transform our relationships in our lives.
Yeah, it is radical. And it can be incredibly challenging to put into practice, especially when we're dealing with those who, trigger our deepest wounds and insecurities. But the potential for growth and healing is, immense.
So what are some practical ways we can cultivate this perspective, especially in those, challenging relationships where it feels the most difficult?
Well, I think it starts with recognizing that our reactions to others are often a reflection of, our own internal state. When we're feeling triggered, reactive, or, judgmental, it's an opportunity to kind of pause and ask ourselves, what's going on inside of me right now? What's being activated within me?
It's like using those challenging interactions as a mirror,
Yeah.
to reflect back to us our own patterns, our beliefs, our unresolved wounds.
Exactly. And when we can do that with compassion and understanding, we start to shift from a place of blame and judgment to a place of curiosity and empathy.
So instead of asking, why are they doing this to me? We might ask, what can I learn from this interaction? What's being mirrored back to me that I might need to address within myself?
Exactly. And it's not about condoning harmful behavior or accepting mistreatment, right? It's about recognizing that everyone is, doing their best with the resources they have.
And that everyone, even those who seem to be causing us pain, is ultimately seeking happiness.
Yeah.
However misguided their actions might be.
Exactly. And when we can tap into that understanding, it opens up a whole new level of compassion and forgiveness.
Yeah.
It allows us to see the humanity in even the most challenging individuals.
And perhaps to see the teacher in disguise.
Exactly.
So let's move on to the third principle, which is about, transmuting envy into inspiration. This is what I'm particularly interested in exploring further because I think it's something that many of us struggle with, especially in our modern world, where we're constantly bombarded with images of other people's seemingly perfect lives.
It's true. Social media in particular can be such a breeding ground for envy and comparison,
So-
We see these curated versions of people's lives, often highlighting their successes and achievements, and it's so easy to fall into the trap of comparing ourselves and, feeling inadequate.
I think it taps into that primal fear of scarcity, the fear that there's not enough to go around, that someone else's success somehow diminishes our own chances of achieving happiness or fulfillment.
It's like we're operating from a zero-sum game mentality, believing that if someone else wins, we automatically lose.
Right. But this principle challenges us to shift our perspective,
Yeah.
to see the world through a lens of abundance, recognizing that there's enough joy, enough success, enough love to go around for everyone.
Exactly. And it reminds us that another person's success doesn't diminish our own potential for those things. In fact, it can serve as a source of inspiration and motivation.
Instead of feeling resentful or envious, we can ask ourselves, what is it about this person's journey that resonates with me? What qualities or achievements do I admire in them? And how can I use their success as a catalyst to pursue my own goals and dreams?
It's about reframing envy as a form of, guidance, a signpost pointing us toward what we truly desire.
I love that. It's like saying, hey, if they can do it, maybe I can too. It's about harnessing that energy of envy and channeling it into something positive and constructive.
Yeah, and it's about recognizing that everyone has their own, unique journey. Just because someone else is achieving something that we desire, it doesn't mean that we're somehow failing or falling behind.
Right. We're all on our own timeline. And it's important to, honor that. Comparison truly is the thief of joy. When we can focus on our own path and celebrate our own progress, we free ourselves from the, tyranny of envy.
And we open ourselves up to the possibility of experiencing genuine joy for other people's successes, which in turn, expands our own capacity for happiness.
So moving on to the fourth principle, which is about finding a balance between, high standards for ourselves and tolerance for others. I think this is something that many of us, especially those who are, driven and ambitious, struggle with.
It is a delicate balance. On the one hand, having high standards for ourselves can be incredibly motivating. It propels us towards excellence in our work, our relationships, and, our personal growth. But on the other hand, holding others to those same, rigid standards can lead to, frustration, disappointment, and strained relationships.
It's almost like we're setting ourselves and everyone around us up for failure. Because let's face it, none of us are perfect, right?
Yeah, it's true. We all have our flaws, our imperfections, our areas where we're still growing and learning. And it's important to remember that growth is a process, not a destination.
Right. The article phrases this principle as, be the best you can be, but don't expect everyone else to be on the same level.
Oh, I love that. It's such a great reminder that we're all works in progress and that it's okay to be at different stages of, development.
And I think it's also about recognizing that our expectations of others are often like projections of our own internalized beliefs and values.
It's true. We often judge others based on, the standards that we hold for ourselves. But it's important to remember that everyone has their own set of values and priorities. And what's important to us may not be as important to, someone else.
So it's about letting go of that need to control or change others and instead focusing on, our own growth and development.
Exactly. And when we can do that, we create a more, peaceful and harmonious environment for everyone.
And I think this principle also ties back to that idea of self-compassion.
Mm-hmm.
When we can extend the same kindness and understanding to ourselves that we would offer to, like a dear friend, it becomes easier to be patient and tolerant of others, doesn't it?
Such a wise observation. Self-compassion is essential for, inner peace. When we're constantly criticizing ourselves or comparing ourselves to others, we create a lot of unnecessary suffering.
Yeah, it's about giving ourselves the same grace and understanding that we would offer to, someone we love.
Absolutely. And when we can do that, it creates this ripple effect, making it easier to extend that same compassion to others.
So moving on to the fifth principle, which is about recognizing that emotional suffering is often a choice. I'm struck by how this concept challenges that notion that we are simply victims of our circumstances.
Mm-hmm.
It suggests that we have a certain degree of agency over our own experience.
It is a radical idea, isn't it, to suggest that we have a choice in how we suffer. But that's precisely the point of this principle. It's not about denying the reality of pain or pretending that those difficult experiences don't hurt, It's about recognizing that we have a choice in how we relate to those experiences.
The article uses the example of betrayal, right? He's saying that if someone betrays us, we can choose to suffer or we can choose to, accept, learn, and move forward. But that choice can feel so elusive, especially when the pain is, fresh and intense.
It can, yeah. And it's important to acknowledge that healing takes time. We're not suggesting that we should just snap our fingers and instantly let go of pain or trauma. But what this principle invites us to consider is that we're not simply at the mercy of our emotions. We have the power to choose how we respond to them.
So instead of being consumed by those emotions, we can kind of observe them with a sense of detachment, recognizing that they're temporary states, like waves passing through the ocean of our being. We can acknowledge the pain without letting it define us.
Beautifully said. And that's where practices like, mindfulness and meditation can be so helpful. They provide us with those tools to cultivate that awareness, to create that space between our emotions and our reactions. It gives us that freedom to choose, a more skillful response.
It's like we're training our minds to become more like a calm observer, right? Witnessing the storms of emotions without getting swept away by them.
Exactly. And the more we practice, the stronger that observer becomes, and the more ease we experience in navigating, those inevitable ups and downs of life.
So this principle isn't about denying or suppressing our emotions, but rather about shifting our relationship to them, right? Recognizing that we are not our thoughts or our emotions. We are something much greater, something capable of experiencing the full spectrum of human emotions, without becoming consumed by them.
Absolutely. We are the awareness that observes the thoughts and emotions, not the thoughts and emotions themselves. And that awareness is always peaceful, always present, always available to us, regardless of what's happening in our lives.
This conversation is reminding me of a quote by Viktor Frankl, the Holocaust survivor and author of Man's Search for Meaning. He said, "Between stimulus and response, there is a space. In that space is our power to choose our response. In our response lies our growth and our freedom."
That's a brilliant quote. And it so perfectly encapsulates the essence of this principle. We always have a choice in how we respond to life's challenges. And it's in that space of choice that our true power lies.
It's like we're being empowered to become the authors of our own experience.
Yeah.
Rather than like being passive characters in a story that's being written for us. Right.
Oh, I love that. And it ties back to, that Buddhist concept of karma, the law of cause and effect. Our choices, our actions, they create those ripples that shape our reality.
So by choosing to respond to those challenging situations with, awareness, compassion, and wisdom, we're not only creating a more peaceful and joyful experience for ourselves, but we're also contributing to a more harmonious and compassionate world.
Absolutely. It's like we're planting seeds of peace and understanding that have the potential to blossom into something truly beautiful.
And that brings us to the sixth principle, which is about the power of acceptance. This one can be so challenging, especially in a world that often encourages us to, strive for perfection and control. So how can we cultivate this quality of acceptance in a way that feels empowering rather than, passive or resigned?
That's a great question. And I think it starts with recognizing that acceptance is not about condoning, harmful behavior or giving up on our dreams or aspirations. It's about acknowledging reality as it is, not as we wish it to be.
It's about making peace with what is, even if what is, painful or challenging.
Exactly. And it's about understanding that resistance, creates suffering. When we fight against reality, when we cling to how we think things should be, we create a lot of internal turmoil and stress.
It's like trying to swim upstream against like a powerful current, right?
Yeah.
It's exhausting.
And
ultimately futile.
It is. But when we can surrender to the flow of life, when we can let go of our resistance and embrace what is, we experience a sense of ease and freedom and even joy.
And it's important to remember that acceptance is a practice, not a destination. It's something that we cultivate over time, moment by moment, through awareness and conscious choice.
Absolutely. And it's a practice that can transform our lives in such profound ways. When we can accept ourselves and others as we are, flaws and all, we open up to a whole new level of compassion and understanding and connection.
And we free ourselves from like the burden of judgment and self-criticism, which can be so heavy to carry, right?
So true. Acceptance is about lightening our load, allowing ourselves to, flow with the current of life rather than constantly battling against it.
And, this idea of acceptance actually connects beautifully with the next principle, which is about finding harmony with nature. The article suggests that spending time in nature, observing its effortless wisdom and integrating it into our lives can be a really powerful source of peace.
Oh, this is one of my favorite principles because it speaks to that, profound connection between our inner world and the natural world. The natural world is constantly teaching us about like cycles of growth, decay, and renewal. When we reconnect with nature, we tap into this like deeper rhythm that can help us to feel more, grounded and at peace amidst all the chaos of modern life.
It's like we're remembering our place in like the grand scheme of things, recognizing that we're part of something so much greater than ourselves.
Exactly. And that recognition can be incredibly humbling and liberating, It helps to put our own problems and worries into perspective, reminding us that we're not alone in our struggles.
The article even quotes the Buddha on this, saying, "Just as a candle cannot burn without fire, men cannot live without a spiritual life."
Such a beautiful quote. And it speaks to the importance of, nourishing our souls, connecting with something greater than ourselves. And nature provides such a beautiful and accessible pathway to that connection.
Absolutely. Nature's like a mirror,
Right.
reflecting back to us our own true nature, our own interconnectedness with all of life. And it reminds us that we are a part of nature, not separate from it.
Exactly, yeah. So when we care for the natural world, we're also caring for ourselves.
Beautifully said.
Yep.
So how can we bring, more nature into our daily routines? Even small things like, taking a walk in the park or paying attention to the sunrise. Those can make a difference, right?
Absolutely. Even a few minutes of, mindful connection with nature can have a profound impact on our well-being. It can help to reduce stress, improve our mood, and even boost our creativity.
Sometimes, just stepping outside and taking a few deep breaths of fresh air can like completely shift my perspective and bring this sense of calm. It's like hitting the reset button on my nervous system.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think it's also about cultivating a sense of awe and wonder for the natural world. When we can appreciate the beauty of a flower or, the majesty of a mountain or the intricate patterns of a seashell, it opens up this like sense of wonder and gratitude that can transform our whole outlook on life.
I love that. And I think this principle ties back to those earlier ones about acceptance and letting go, right? When we observe the natural world, we see that everything is in constant flux. There's a time for growth and a time for dormancy, a time for expansion, and a time for contraction.
Exactly. And by aligning ourselves with those, natural rhythms, we can find more ease and flow in our own lives.
And that brings us to another principle that I think is really foundational for inner peace: ethical living. The article emphasizes that connection between, acting with integrity and experiencing a calm mind.
This is where that Buddhist concept of, right action comes into play. It's about aligning our actions with our values and striving to live in a way that benefits both ourselves and, others.
The article paraphrases this principle beautifully. It says, when your actions are in line with your values, you naturally feel more at peace. It's like walking our talk, right? Living in a way that reflects our, deepest beliefs and aspirations.
Yeah, it's so true. When we live with integrity, we don't have to worry about, hiding our actions or feeling guilty about our choices. There's a sense of inner alignment that brings a deep sense of peace.
And the article connects this principle back to, some core Buddhist teachings.
Yeah.
Right speech, right livelihood, right action. These are all interconnected aspects of, ethical living, aren't they?
Absolutely. Right speech encourages us to speak truthfully and kindly, avoiding, gossip and harsh words and divisive language. Right livelihood calls us to engage in work that is aligned with our values and doesn't, harm others. And right action reminds us to act with compassion, generosity, and mindfulness in all areas of our lives.
It's about living a life that feels, authentic and true to ourselves. A life that reflects our deepest values and aspirations.
Yeah.
So let me ask you this. Are there any areas of your life where you've consciously made choices to align your actions with your values, even if those choices were, difficult or inconvenient? I'm always inspired by people who walk their talk, who live their values in a tangible way.
That's such a great question, and I appreciate you asking. I think for me, one of the most significant areas has been in my relationships. For a long time, I struggled with setting healthy boundaries and speaking my truth, especially in relationships where I felt this strong need for approval or acceptance.
Yeah, it's so easy to fall into those patterns, especially in relationships where we, feel vulnerable or insecure.
It is. But what I've learned is that true intimacy and connection can only flourish when we're willing to be authentic and vulnerable, even if that means, risking conflict or discomfort.
So it's about honoring ourselves, our values, and our needs, even when it feels challenging.
Right. Exactly. And it's about recognizing that setting boundaries and speaking our truth is actually an act of love, both for ourselves and for the other person. It creates a more honest and authentic foundation for the relationship to, grow.
Oh, I love that. It's we're creating this container of safety and trust where both people can, feel seen and heard and respected.
Yeah. And, it's fascinating how making those difficult choices, those choices that require courage and vulnerability, they often lead to the greatest sense of peace and fulfillment. It's we're aligning ourselves with our, soul's purpose, and that alignment brings a deep sense of inner harmony.
We're finally stepping into our power.
Yeah.
Embracing our authentic selves, and that can be incredibly liberating.
It is. And it reminds me of the next principle, which is about the transformative power of gratitude. The article emphasizes the importance of shifting our focus from what we lack to what we have, training our minds to appreciate that abundance that already exists in our lives.
Gratitude is such a powerful antidote to negativity and dissatisfaction. When we can cultivate a grateful heart, we start to see the world through a different lens, right? We notice the simple joys, we appreciate the kindness of others, and we find beauty in those everyday moments that we might otherwise, take for granted.
Yeah, it's we're switching from a scarcity mindset to, an abundance mindset, recognizing the richness that already surrounds us, even in the midst of, challenges.
The article even suggests, keeping a gratitude journal.
Yeah.
Writing down those things that we're grateful for each day, just to really cultivate that awareness.
Yeah.
Have you ever tried that practice? I'm always curious to hear about people's, personal experiences with these principles.
I have, yeah. And it's been such a powerful practice for me. I started keeping a gratitude journal a few years ago during a particularly challenging time in my life, and it completely shifted my perspective. It helped me to focus on the good, even when things felt really difficult. And it reminded me of all the blessings I had to be thankful for.
It's amazing how something so simple can have such a profound impact on our well-being, you know?
It is, and it doesn't have to be anything elaborate. Just taking a few minutes each day to kind of reflect on what we're grateful for can make a world of difference.
And I think it's also important to express our gratitude to others.
Yeah.
Taking the time to thank someone for their kindness or support, it can make such a big difference, both for the recipient and for ourselves, right?
It's true. Gratitude is contagious. When we express it, it creates this ripple effect of positivity and goodwill.
And finally, let's circle back to the 10th principle, which is about letting go. We touched on this a little bit earlier, but I think it's worth exploring a bit further because it's such a central theme in Buddhist philosophy. And it can be so challenging to put into practice.
It is a challenging practice, but the more we can cultivate this ability to, let go, the more freedom and ease we experience in our lives.
So how can we practically cultivate the art of letting go?
Well, I think it starts with, recognizing what we're holding on to. What are the thoughts, beliefs, or attachments that are, causing us suffering?
It's like shining a light on those dark corners of our minds where we're clinging to things that are no longer serving us, right?
Exactly. And once we've identified those attachments, we can begin to gently loosen our grip.
And that loosening of our grip might involve practices like forgiveness, acceptance, or simply, choosing to focus our attention on something else.
It could also involve rituals or practices that help us to symbolically release what we're holding on to. For example, writing down what we want to let go of and then burning the paper. That can be a powerful way to create a sense of closure and release.
Oh, I love that. And I think it's important to remember that letting go is not a one-time event. It's an ongoing process, a practice that we can return to again and again as we continue to evolve and grow.
Absolutely. And it's a practice that can bring incredible freedom and peace into our lives.
So it seems like all of these principles are interconnected in some way, right?
Absolutely, yeah. They all kind of point back to those same core truths about the nature of reality and, the path to inner peace. They're different pathways leading to the same destination.
They're different facets of the same jewel.
Oh, that's a beautiful way to put it. And I think the more we explore these principles, the more we see how they, weave together to create this tapestry of wisdom and insight.
It's like a map guiding us towards a more peaceful and fulfilling life.
Exactly. And it's a map that's available to all of us, regardless of our, background, beliefs, or experiences.
I love that.
Huh.
So as we wrap up this part of our deep dive, what are some key takeaways that you want to leave our listeners with?
Well, I think the most important takeaway is that inner peace is not something that we find outside of ourselves, right? It's something that we cultivate from within through mindful practices and a shift in perspective.
Yeah, it's about learning to respond to, life's challenges with more grace, compassion, and wisdom.
Exactly. And I think these 10 principles offer a really powerful framework for doing just that.
So as we move into the final part of our deep dive, what can our listeners, look forward to?
We'll be exploring some practical ways to integrate these principles into our, daily lives, and we'll be discussing how these teachings can help us to navigate the complexities of the modern world with, more peace and skill.
Sounds fascinating. I can't wait to dive back in. See you soon for part 3 of our deep dive into 10 Buddhist principles for unshakable peace. Welcome back to our exploration of these 10 Buddhist principles for unshakable peace. It's been quite a journey so far.
It really has. We've covered so much ground, from handling criticism to embracing gratitude, and yet it feels like we've only just, scratched the surface of these teachings.
I know. It's like with every principle, we're peeling back these layers and revealing these new insights and connections, But as we move into this final part of our conversation, I'm curious to shift our focus to the practical application of these principles. How can we actually integrate them into our daily lives?
Yeah.
Amidst all the busyness and distractions of, the modern world?
It's a great question. It's one thing to intellectually grasp these concepts, but I think the real transformation happens when we can actually embody them in our actions, our reactions.
Totally. So let's dive into that. Let's explore some practical ways we can bring these principles to life, starting with that first one about handling insults and criticism with grace. That untouchable mountain analogy, it's such a powerful image, but how do we actually cultivate that resilience, in the heat of the moment, right? When someone's words feel like they're aimed right at our heart?
Well, one practice that's been incredibly helpful for me is to cultivate a pause between the stimulus and my response. So instead of reacting immediately, I try to just take a breath, creating that space for, awareness to arise.
It's like hitting that pause button before we hit the send button on that, heated email, right? Giving ourselves a moment to cool down before we say or do something that we might regret.
Exactly, yeah. And in that pause, we can ask ourselves some key questions, like what's going on inside of me right now? Or is this criticism actually true? And even if it is, do I need to take it personally?
Those are such powerful questions. And I think it's important to remember that not all criticism is created equal. Some criticism can be constructive, offering valuable feedback that can actually help us grow.
Absolutely, yeah. And learning to discern between, constructive criticism and just simply hurtful words, that's a valuable skill. But even when the criticism is hurtful, we can choose to respond with, grace rather than defensiveness.
And I think that ties back to that idea of remembering that the person launching those arrows, they're often acting from their own pain or insecurity.
Mm-hmm.
Their words are more a reflection of their inner state than a true reflection of our worth.
Beautifully said. And when we can see that, it becomes easier to cultivate compassion, for both ourselves and the other person.
So moving on to the second principle about seeing everyone as a teacher. I'm wondering if you have any practical tips for putting this into practice. It's such a radical idea to view even the most challenging people in our lives as potential sources of wisdom and growth.
It is radical, but it can be incredibly liberating when we can shift our perspective, from judgment to curiosity. So instead of labeling people as good or bad, we can approach each interaction with a kind of beginner's mind, asking ourselves, what can I learn from this person? What lesson are they here to teach me?
It's like turning life into a giant classroom where every interaction, every encounter is an opportunity to learn and grow.
Exactly. And it's about recognizing that those most challenging relationships, they often offer the, greatest opportunities for growth. Those are the relationships that push our buttons, They trigger our insecurities and force us to confront our shadow sides.
So instead of avoiding those challenging relationships, we can lean into them, recognizing that they're holding up a mirror to our own unresolved issues, our own patterns of reactivity.
Yeah. And it's not about blaming ourselves or, feeling ashamed of our reactions. It's about cultivating self-awareness and compassion, recognizing that we're all works in progress, and that those difficult people are often reflecting back to us aspects of ourselves that, we might not be fully conscious of.
It's like those difficult people are our spiritual workout buddies, pushing us to develop our emotional muscles.
Oh, I love that analogy. And it's important to remember that we don't have to everyone or condone harmful behavior to see them as potential teachers, right?
Exactly. It's about recognizing that everyone, even those who behave in ways that we don't agree with, they're ultimately seeking happiness and fulfillment.
Yeah.
However misguided their actions might be.
And that recognition can open our hearts to a whole new level of compassion and, understanding.
So moving on to the third principle about transmuting envy into inspiration. I think this is one that resonates with a lot of people, especially in today's social media driven culture, where it's so easy to compare ourselves to others and feel like we're, coming up short.
Absolutely. Social media can be such a breeding ground for envy and self-doubt. We're constantly bombarded with images of other people's highlight reels, their curated versions of success and happiness. And it's so easy to fall into the trap of comparing ourselves and feeling inadequate.
Yeah, it's we're constantly being fed this message that we're not enough, not smart enough, not attractive enough, not successful enough. And it can be so exhausting and demoralizing.
It can. But the good news is that, we have a choice in how we respond to those messages. We can choose to buy into that comparison game, or we can choose to opt out.
So how do we, opt out? How do we transmute that envy into something positive and constructive?
Well, I think it starts with becoming aware of our triggers. What are the situations or people that tend to evoke feelings of envy in us?
Once we've, identified those triggers, we can start to consciously shift our perspective. Instead of focusing on what we lack, we can choose to focus on what we appreciate about our own lives, our own unique strengths and gifts.
Exactly. Yeah. And we can also ask ourselves, what is it about this person's situation that I'm drawn to? What qualities or achievements do I admire in them?
And then instead of letting that envy fester, we can channel that energy into inspiration, right? We can use it as fuel to pursue our own goals and dreams.
Right. It's like saying, hey, if they can do it, maybe I can too. It's about harnessing that energy of envy and channeling it into something positive and constructive.
And it's about remembering that another person's success doesn't diminish our own potential for success.
Right.
There's enough abundance to go around for everyone.
Yeah. So instead of seeing other people's successes as a threat, we can choose to see them as, inspiration, as proof that anything is possible if we set our minds to it and take action.
Oh, I love that. It's about shifting from a scarcity mindset to an abundance mindset, recognizing that there's enough success, enough happiness, enough love to go around for everyone.
And it's about celebrating other people's successes without feeling threatened or diminished. When we can genuinely rejoice in another person's achievements, it expands our own capacity for joy and fulfillment.
And it's interesting how this principle connects back to that idea of, seeing everyone as a teacher. When we can view other people's successes as sources of inspiration and learning, it can actually motivate us to achieve our own goals.
It's true. Instead of feeling resentful or envious, we can ask ourselves, what can I learn from this person's journey? What steps did they take to achieve their success? How can I apply those lessons to my own life?
Yeah, it's about turning envy into a fuel for growth and development.
Exactly. And I think that's such a powerful shift in perspective. It allows us to see other people as allies and collaborators rather than competitors or rivals. And it reminds us that, we're all in this together, supporting each other on our unique journeys.
Okay, so moving on to the fourth principle, which is about finding that balance between high standards for ourselves and tolerance for others. I think this is one that a lot of us, especially those of us who are driven and ambitious, we struggle with this. How do we hold ourselves to a high standard, without becoming overly critical of ourselves or judgmental of others?
It's a delicate dance for sure. And I think it starts with self-awareness. We need to be honest with ourselves about our own strength and weaknesses, and we need to be realistic about our expectations, both of ourselves and of others.
It's about recognizing that we're all works in progress, and that it's okay to, make mistakes, to have bad days, to not always be perfect.
Exactly. And it's about, giving ourselves permission to be human, to not have it all figured out.
And I think it's also about being mindful of our language. Both the language that we use to talk to ourselves and the language that we use to talk to, others.
Absolutely. Our words have such a powerful impact, both on ourselves and on those around us.
So instead of using harsh or judgmental language, we could try to speak to ourselves and others with, kindness and compassion. We can offer, encouragement and support rather than criticism and judgment.
And we can also practice forgiveness, both for ourselves and for others, right? We all make mistakes, and holding on to grudges or resentment, it just creates more suffering for everyone involved.
It's like we're choosing to release those, toxic emotions, freeing up space in our hearts for more love and compassion.
Beautifully said. And I think it's important to remember that, forgiveness doesn't mean condoning harmful behavior or forgetting what happened. It's about releasing the grip that those, negative emotions have on us so that we can move forward with more peace and freedom.
And, it's interesting how this principle connects back to that idea of non-attachment. When we can let go of our attachment to being right, to, having things be a certain way, it becomes easier to be more tolerant and forgiving of both ourselves and others.
That's a great connection. And non-attachment, it doesn't mean becoming indifferent or apathetic. It's about recognizing that everything is in constant flux, everything's impermanent, and that our happiness doesn't depend on clinging to things staying the same.
It's about learning to ride the waves of change with more grace and ease, knowing that even in the midst of storms, there's a stillness and peace at our core that can never be disturbed.
Oh, so beautifully put. And I think that brings us to a natural transition to the fifth principle, which is about recognizing that emotional suffering is often a choice. Now, I know this can be a challenging concept to grasp, especially when we're in the midst of intense pain or grief. But the article points to the idea that while those painful experiences are, inevitable, the degree to which we suffer as a result of those experiences is often influenced by, our own minds.
It's like that old saying, pain is inevitable, suffering is optional.
Exactly. And I think it's important to clarify that we're not suggesting that anyone is, intentionally choosing to suffer. But the principle invites us to consider that we have more agency than we might realize in how we respond to those, difficult experiences.
So it's not about denying or suppressing our emotions, but rather about shifting our relationship to them.
Absolutely. It's about recognizing that we are not our thoughts or our emotions. We are the awareness that observes the thoughts and emotions.
And that awareness is always peaceful, always present, always available to us, regardless of what's happening in our lives.
Beautifully said. And I think that's where practices like mindfulness and meditation can be so helpful. They provide us with tools to cultivate that awareness, to create a space between our emotions and our reactions, giving us the freedom to choose a more, skillful response.
Yeah, it's like we're training our minds to become more like, a calm observer, witnessing those storms of emotions without getting swept away by them.
Exactly. And the more we practice, the stronger that observer becomes, and the more ease we experience in navigating, those inevitable ups and downs of life.
So what are some practical ways that we can apply this principle in our daily lives?
One practice that I find really helpful is to just, notice when I'm getting hooked by an emotion. Anger, sadness, fear, whatever it might be.
It's like becoming a detective of our own inner world.
Yeah.
Paying attention to those subtle cues that signal when we're getting caught in a negative thought pattern or an emotional spiral.
Yeah. Exactly. And then instead of, resisting or trying to suppress those emotions, we can simply acknowledge them, allowing ourselves to feel them fully without judgment.
It's like saying to ourselves, okay, I'm feeling angry right now. I see you anger. I'm not going to fight you, but I'm also not going to let you control me.
And then from that place of awareness, we can, choose a more skillful response. Maybe that means taking a few deep breaths, going for a walk, or simply shifting our attention to something more positive.
Yeah, it's like we're reclaiming our power, choosing how we want to respond to those challenging emotions, rather than letting them dictate our actions.
Beautifully said. And I think that's what this principle is all about, empowering ourselves to choose peace, even in the midst of, difficult circumstances.
It's fascinating how all of these principles that we've discussed, from handling criticism to letting go, they all seem to point back to this, core concept of awareness, cultivating a deeper understanding of our own minds and how they operate.
That's a brilliant observation. And I think that's the essence of Buddhist philosophy, It's an invitation to cultivate mindful awareness, to observe our thoughts, emotions, and behaviors without judgment, and to use that awareness to make more skillful choices that lead to, greater peace, freedom, and fulfillment.
It's like we're being given this set of tools to, navigate the complexities of human experience with more grace and wisdom. Tools that can help us to create a more peaceful and joyful reality.
Right.
For ourselves and, for the world around us.
So well said. And I think that's a perfect note to end on.
I agree. Well, thank you so much for joining us on this deep dive into these 10 powerful Buddhist principles for unshakable peace. We hope you found it insightful and, inspiring.
It's been a pleasure exploring these teachings with you.
And to our listeners, we encourage you to continue exploring these principles and to see how they can, transform your own life. Until next time, may you be well and may you find peace.